Nicole Cooper, an American schoolteacher, reprimanded one of her students for never doing homework and demanded to meet his parents, but the next day only his grandmother showed up, claiming he was sick. Suspicious, the teacher made a surprise visit to the family and discovered that the boy's life was much more disturbing than she expected. Mrs. Cooper was eager to start her first day as a history teacher at school. She had prepared a lesson on World War II and hoped to impress her students with her knowledge and enthusiasm. She arrived early in the classroom, reviewed her slides and notes, and felt confident that everything would go well. When the bell rang, she saw the 7th grade students entering the room, chatting and laughing among themselves. She stood up and introduced herself with a smile, saying she was the new history teacher and was happy to meet them. The students fell silent and sat at their desks, curious about the new teacher. Mrs. Cooper began her introduction to World War II, using images and videos to illustrate her lesson. She asked some questions to the students, who responded with interest and attention. The class was going well until the classroom door burst open with a bang. All eyes turned to the boy, who walked slowly to his desk without looking at anyone and sat with his head down. Mrs. Cooper was surprised and didn't like the interruption. She asked him to stand up and introduce himself. "My name is Itten," the young man said, embarrassed, then fell completely silent. Mrs. Cooper tried to be kind and said he was welcome to her class, but he should be more responsible and punctual next time. She also asked to see his homework, but when Itten handed over his notebook, the teacher quickly realized that there was nothing written in it. There was no homework done since the beginning of the semester. Mrs. Cooper was astonished by the boy's lack of commitment and said she would like to speak to his parents the next day. Itten lowered his head again. He heard some laughs and comments from his classmates, couldn't find any argument to get out of this predicament, so he just nodded in agreement with his new teacher's request. He wanted to disappear from there, but had to endure the rest of the class in silence. The next day, however, Itten didn't show up at school. Mrs. Cooper was worried and wondered if she had been too harsh on him. Ultimately, the teacher wanted to help him, not push him away. She waited until the end of the day, but Itten didn't show up. Before she could go to the teacher's lounge, she saw a lady in her probable 70s. The teacher approached the elderly woman and politely asked if she was looking for someone. The lady said her name was Margaret Carter and she was looking for Mrs. Cooper herself. Margaret explained that her grandson was sick and couldn't go to school that day. The teacher lamented the situation and hoped the boy would get well soon. Shortly after, Margaret mentioned that her grandson had told her that the new teacher wanted to meet his parents, so the grandmother decided to go to the school to find out what the problem was. Upon hearing the elderly woman's words, Mrs. Cooper felt a certain tension. She said she would like to ensure that the young man received the necessary help to maintain his grades, since he hadn't done any homework during that semester and she heard he was always late for class. Itten's grandmother sighed and lowered her eyes. She explained that his mother had been ill for a long time but promised to try to talk to her to come to school to talk to the teacher. The elderly woman thanked the teacher for her attention and said she had to leave. Mrs. Cooper felt frustrated and powerless. She didn't believe this would be beneficial for the boy's future. She escorted the elderly woman to the school gate. Upon reaching the gate, they met the principal. "Good afternoon, Mr. Davis, Mrs. Margaret." "Is everything okay?" the principal asked, noticing the distress on Ethan's grandmother's face. She explained the situation to the man and hurried away, realizing something was wrong. Principal Davis called Mrs. Cooper to his office. The director then said that since Ethan's father's death, his mother had started working many hours a day as a school janitor. But one day, she simply stopped going to work. He even tried to contact her, but never got a response from the woman. After a few weeks, the director found out that she had gotten lost in some kind of addiction. The teacher was shocked to hear this. She felt guilty for being harsh with the young man the day before. The director continued talking about Ethan's situation at school and how the team. Following month, Mrs. Cooper immediately opposed. It wasn't fair to do that to the young man in that situation. The director said he understood. All the staff felt very sorry for what Ethan had gone through, but they had a responsibility to the other students. It was a respected institution and it was necessary to maintain academic standards. The teacher was shocked by her colleague's decision to expel Ethan from school. She couldn't stop thinking about the uncertain fate awaiting the boy. The teacher insisted with the director, arguing that the young man deserved a chance to redeem himself. However, the director stated that they had already given the boy enough chances and that he was increasingly tarnishing the school's reputation. He gave Mrs. Cooper a month to present her assessment of the boy so that the expulsion could be legally justified, with evidence. "It won't be difficult. I saw his terrible grades last semester," the director laughed. Feeling defeated, Mrs. Cooper continued to worry about Ethan's future, determined not to give up. An idea came to her mind as she drove home. She decided to go to Ethan's residence and tell the boy's mother about the situation. Upon arriving at the house, Mrs. Cooper knocked on the door, but no one answered. Worried, she decided to take extreme action and turned the doorknob, finding it unlocked. As soon as she entered, she was met with a heartbreaking scene: empty bottles of whiskey and vodka scattered on the floor, the strong smell of alcohol filling the room, explaining the heavy atmosphere. The teacher felt stunned by the sad reality that was revealed. While trying to process the situation, Mrs. Margaret appeared and surprised Mrs. Cooper. Ethan's grandmother was surprised to find the teacher in the living room. The woman explained to the elderly lady that she was there to meet the boy's mother, but her attention was immediately diverted when two small children, about 4 and 6 years old, appeared, hiding behind their grandmother. Faced with this unexpected scene, the teacher paused and asked if those were also her grandchildren. The grandmother confirmed, but in a somewhat harsh tone. Feeling embarrassed, Mrs. Cooper apologized for invading the old lady's house, but took the opportunity to ask about Ethan. She wanted to know if she could see the boy. The elderly lady stuttered in surprise as she replied that she had asked the boy to fetch some medicines. The teacher was curious, as the elderly lady had mentioned earlier that Ethan was sick. Then, the elderly lady asked the teacher to leave, and that's what she did immediately. As she walked towards her car, Mrs. Cooper came across Ethan returning home. His clothes were dirty with dust and cement, and a strong odor of sweat permeated the boy. As soon as the boy saw his teacher, he lowered his head and tried to pretend he didn't know her, but it was too late. Looking into the boy's eyes, Mrs. Cooper noticed his widened eyes filled with fear and embarrassment. She asked where the boy had been all day and why he was so dirty. Itten, visibly tense, briefly replied that he was tired and needed to take a shower. Sensing the boy's fear, the teacher offered her help and asked the boy to trust her. However, Itten refused to speak and insisted that Mrs. Cooper leave immediately and never come back. It was then that the teacher decided to be honest with Itten and talk about the director's decision to expel him from school, but made it clear that she would do everything possible to prevent it. The teacher looked into his eyes and, once again, asked the crucial question, promising not to reprimand him. Itten sighed deeply, finally gathering the courage to speak. He thanked his new teacher for her concern, but didn't believe she could help. And so, Itten's story unfolded before the woman. He shared the difficulties his mother had faced over the years raising him and his siblings. When the teacher asked about his father, the boy replied that he had never met his real father and had always been cared for by his mother and stepfather. However, since his stepfather's death, his mother had started drinking, which had left her unable to work, but the bills kept coming every month. To escape from this reality, the mother began to resort to unknown substances to alleviate the pain. The image of the mother feeding her addiction was deeply engraved in his mind. To help her, he started doing odd jobs after school. He accepted any work he could find. Sometimes, he cleaned the bathroom of a bar, other times, he worked as a bricklayer's assistant. Occasionally, he mowed neighbors' lawns and even sold sweets on the street. His goal was to pay off the household debts, feed his siblings, and perhaps help his mother out of that situation. Compassion filled Mrs. Cooper's heart as she listened attentively to Itten's story. She understood the emotional burden the young man carried on his shoulders. The teacher then looked at the boy and said he was too young to face so many responsibilities. She emphasized that this situation could harm his health and his future. However, Itten responded to Mrs. Cooper's concern with a rhetorical question. That question momentarily left the teacher speechless, but she knew she couldn't allow one of her students to suffer so much and still be expelled from the school he attended. In a hopeful tone, Mrs. Cooper told Itten that he was destined for something better and more promising. She asked Itten to return to school the next day and promised to find a way to help the boy's family. However, Itten was convinced that continuing to attend school made no sense to him. He thought that if he could work longer hours, he could earn more money and thus help his family even more. Poor grades and the possibility of expulsion were not his concerns at that moment. Rather, it was coming home, taking a shower, and cooking dinner for him and his entire family, his task every night. But Mrs. Cooper didn't change her mind and said that education was essential for him and his family to have real growth. The teacher didn't want Itten to give up on his entire future and came up with an idea that could change everything. She said she would bring dinner for him and his family 3 times a week, ensuring it would be enough for the whole week. In exchange, the boy would use the evenings to focus on his studies. She also made it clear that Itten could continue doing his afternoon jobs to help with the household finances, provided he returned to attending morning classes and dedicated himself to improving his grades. The teacher knew that it seemed like complete madness, but she was willing to go beyond the role of a teacher and support Itten. The young man reflected for a few seconds and eventually accepted the proposal when he realized that Mrs. Cooper genuinely wanted to help him. As the days went by, Mrs. Cooper kept her word and began making more frequent visits to Itten's house. She brought not only dinner for the whole family but also constant support and encouragement. While the boy devoted himself to his homework and prepared for exams, Mrs. Cooper's warm presence became an anchor in his life. They built a relationship of trust and respect, with the teacher becoming an important figure for Iten. After 40 days of anxiety, the moment Mrs. Cooper had been waiting for finally arrived, the exam results. To her joy, Iten's grades had improved significantly, surpassing all expectations. But when Principal Davis saw that Iten had improved his grades, his face was filled with frustration. How would he justify to the board the expulsion of the boy now? His hands were tied. When he learned of the grades, Iten ran to Mrs. Cooper to thank her with a tight hug, saying that if it weren't for her, none of that would have been possible. With a smile, she replied that he was the true responsible for that, since his grades had improved in all subjects due to his hard work. However, the next day, when Mrs. Cooper went to Iten's house to bring dinner once again, she was dismayed by the news she received. The girl's grandmother was desperate outside the house. The teacher approached, and the grandmother, in tears, recounted that shortly after Iten arrived from work, someone knocked on the door. To everyone's surprise, they were social workers from the Child Protection Service. In a quick inspection, the agents detected that the living conditions in that house were not suitable for 3 minors. So, the agents took the 3 siblings so that they could have the chance to live in a family that offered them a dignified life. While Ing's siblings cried, the boy tried to resist, clinging to the legs of the social worker, pleading for them not to take them away. But the boy's pleas were in vain. The next day, already at home, Mrs. Cooper received a call that squeezed her heart. It was Iten calling from the orphanage. He had tried to contact his mother, but never managed to speak to her. As a last resort, he called the teacher, hoping she could help him. On the phone, Mrs. Cooper was scared by the desperation in the boy's voice. She tried to calm him down while trying to find out what had happened. Rushing to her car, Mrs. Cooper swore to Ian that she would do everything to help them. When the teacher arrived at the orphanage, she saw Ian and his little siblings crying. The eldest boy said that his whole world had collapsed and that he felt a lot of anger towards the school principal. In Iten's mind, that man always wanted to get rid of him, and when he saw that he couldn't legally expel him from school, he resorted to sending social workers. Confused, the teacher tried to understand why the boy was blaming Mr. Davis. Then, Iten revealed that months ago, in a moment of his mother's drunkenness, she had said that the boy was the son of Principal Davis himself. Although aware that his mother used to talk nonsense when she drank, the boy managed to see truth in his mother's serious look. That revelation hit the teacher like a bombshell. Now everything made sense. Iten's mother had worked as a janitor at the school. Mr. Davis's actions, and his eagerness to distance himself from that boy as quickly as possible. Stunned, the teacher told the boy that she would help him and his siblings as much as she could, and that's what she did. The orphanage as long as she could until life pushed her and Iten in opposite directions. 15 years had passed since that day, as if in the blink of an eye, and Iten, now a man, entered the school that had once been his. He had gone through some very difficult moments there. As he walked through the familiar corridors, Iten couldn't help but feel a mixture of nostalgia and sentimentality. Suddenly, a voice came from the loudspeakers, asking him to come to the principal's office. To his surprise, The person waiting for him was his former history teacher, Mrs. Cooper. He asked for permission to enter the office, and Mrs. Cooper greeted him, asking if he was a new candidate for the English teacher position. Mrs. Cooper had just returned from a trip and had been informed that a man would visit the school for an interview, but she hadn't had time to see his file yet. Itten was speechless, but his face was shining with a big smile. He felt the same welcoming kindness he had known years ago. "Mrs. Cooper, it's me, Itten. Do you remember me?" the man finally asked, no longer wearing dirty and smelly clothes. "Itten," Mrs. Cooper choked. "Oh God, Jesus, Itten, is that you? I'm so happy to see you, Itten, my boy. Look at you, you've grown so much." "I'm very happy that you still remember me," said Itten, moving Mrs. Cooper, who moved towards the boy and gave him a long, affectionate hug. Itten returned the hug from his youth teacher and was deeply moved as well. However, he noticed there was something beyond happiness in the woman's demeanor. It was as if there was a mix of sadness in her gaze. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Cooper?" Itten asked. Then the teacher revealed what she had discovered years after Itten had been taken to the orphanage. The former principal was indeed responsible for reporting Itten's family at that time. "Until today, I don't understand how he could do such a thing." "I'm sorry, Itten, I couldn't do anything," said Mrs. Cooper, "but if it were today, it would be completely different. After all, now I'm the principal of this school." Upon learning that Mrs. Cooper was now in charge, Itten asked what had happened to the former principal, Davis. After all, Itten still had matters to settle with the man. However, Mrs. Cooper broke the news that the former principal had already passed away. The boy took a deep breath before continuing the conversation. Then, he expressed his condolences for the principal's death and later told Mrs. Cooper that he already knew the whole truth about his past. Itten revealed that he had reunited with his mother, and the two had a very serious and sober conversation. It was during this reunion that he learned that Mr. Davis was indeed his biological father. However, Itten also understood that the former principal was never and would never be a real father. Itten, now a grown man, said that despite everything, he harbored no resentment and hoped the principal was at peace. Upon hearing all of this, Mrs. Cooper couldn't help but be moved. Nothing was perfect. But despite everything that had happened in the past, it seemed that things had finally fallen into place. With a smile, Itten expressed that the life he now possessed, his success, and happiness, were all thanks to Mrs. Cooper. "You made me believe in myself when no one else did, teacher. You held my hand when everyone else left me behind. Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. I hope to be able to repay you," said Itten. The current principal wanted to celebrate that moment, but she couldn't leave the school because she was waiting for the new candidate for the English teacher position. So she took the candidate's papers, and to her surprise, she saw Itten's name. There was Itten himself, who had applied for the position. "I can't believe this. If I had seen the documents earlier, I would have thought it was some kind of joke. The world really turns around." The principal couldn't be happier, celebrating. She didn't even want to interview Itten for the position right there and then, and still with tears of happiness in her eyes, she signed the hiring papers. "There, now we'll be together again," said Mrs. Cooper. If you liked the story, I ask that you please leave a like on the video, and this other story that is appearing on the screen now will probably also move you. Enjoy the session and see you in the next video.